transition to our panel for this morning. Our first panelist is apologize if I mispronounce it. Tunua Thrash-Ntuk from LISC, the LISC LA office, where they handle inclusive economic development. We have Rahwa Ghirmatzion, the ED from OpenBuffalo, and we have Mona Magnet from the LISC National Safety and Justice Committee. Each panelist will have approximately 5 minutes, and then we'll save all of our questions again for the end. And so I want to just transition to our first panelist, and for the next 5 minutes, we can just talk a little bit about your background and your work.
Great. Well, thanks so much for the introduction. It's early here in California, in Los Angeles. So my name is Tunua Thrash-Ntuk. You did great. I know it's a unique name, so always happy to say it and repeat it. I want to thank my colleagues in Western New York. I want to thank Julie for inviting me to be here, and happy to be, sharing a bit about the work that we're doing in economic equity in the Los Angeles office. So I have a presentation that I think I'll be walking through shortly as part of the panel. Inspired by the number of folks who are on a Saturday to talk about these issues, I'll just quickly say that, I'm a girl from South Central Los Angeles who had a dream of being able to do more for my community, having grown up really in the 80s and the 90s in a home where my grandparents were frontline workers. My granddad was a garbage man, and my grandmother cleaned hotels, office buildings, and eventually became a janitorial supervisor for City Hall in Los Angeles. So good union paying jobs. And my mom was there, someone who was a teacher and was focused on working with youth with special needs. I know firsthand what it means to be, a Black woman in this country, to lose a father to gun violence at a very young age and to have that case never resolved. But those are the kinds of things that propelled me to want to focus on what I could do to improve my neighborhood. So that meant that I headed off to UC Berkeley and MIT as the first in my family to go to college. That afforded me the chance to be able to do anything I wanted to do, but I decided to come back to my community, to come back to Los Angeles, to South Central in particular, and to work on issues of housing, access, economic development, and racial justice. In my work that I do at LISC today, we'll talk a bit about that. We're working in several neighborhoods, and one neighborhood that I will talk about in particular is South LA. And what we're doing to really identify regional opportunities to be able to transform workforce opportunities, small businesses, as well as key economic districts within that area. So I look forward to our conversation today, and thanks for having me.
All right, and before we transition to our next panelist, would you care just to share an example as it pertains to your work of intersectionality, what that means and how you infuse that into your work?
I'll just add that we're going to try to put the PDF slides up for you right now, Tunua.
Okay. So this is what I had prepared for today in terms of looking at, wanted to transport everybody into South LA and really talk about what an economic inclusion plan might look like there. Next slide. I've already really introduced myself as the executive director of the local office. Next slide. And it appears that most of you know and understand that part of what LISC does is work with residents and partners to forge resilient and inclusive communities of opportunity, to create good places to live, work, visit, do business, and raise a family. Next slide. So I can talk a little bit about what we've been doing in LA. Some of you may have had the experience of having come to Los Angeles before, and really putting a racial equity lens on the work that we're doing. And in this particular case, this was part of a national program where 3 cities within the LISC network, Indianapolis, Philadelphia, as well as Los Angeles, have been embarking on this integrated and place-based approach to economic equity. Next slide. Next slide. So the space here is I'm going to start with this picture because it's a really great space. Some of you may know the Crenshaw Corridor in Los Angeles. It is the heart of the African American community in LA. And this space here is owned by 3 African American entrepreneurs, actually guys, who created a WeWork space for the community. And the space there is one of their community rooms on the corridor. And as part of a conversation that we've been having that is part of what we call our district advisory committee. You know, much like where we like to start is to make sure we've got key data. And so we brought in several advisors to help with that. We've got a national organization that was providing us with some national data, as well as, which was mass economics, as well as a local researcher to look at local data. Part of the things that we know is that life somehow, some way is a little more difficult in South LA. And we know that on a gut level, but sometimes we don't always have the statistics to be able to talk about why that is the case. So one example of that work that we did around data is that we found based on a geographic area within South LA, in particular, some of our lowest income areas, we found that about 10% of the population or more was driving more than 50 miles a day to a job that was paying them less than $20,000 a year. So that's a lot of transportation costs, time, and energy to get somewhere where you really aren't able to sustain yourself at all as an individual, let alone as a family. So part of where we started was making sure we had that kind of data so that we could understand where we might need to go in addition to those gut checks that we had around why life has been so difficult for so many South LA residents. So we were building on years of local organizing and planning. And you can next slide, our whole goal was to really bring together a group of local stakeholders who could help lead the conversation and process. Next slide. Some of you might know Los Angeles and you might know South LA. This is the map. I like maps, so I like to try and orient people. This is for LA, you know, it spans almost 6 miles probably across. And we divided it into zones. Again, I talked about the Crenshaw Corridor, which is the heart of the African American community in South LA. You've got several legacy Black-owned businesses there. You've got an arts culture there with the Lamert Park Vision Theater. Zone 2 is actually where USC is. USC is in the middle of South LA, along with the stadium, the Coliseum. You also have the Lucas Museum coming. George Lucas is building a world-class museum in South LA. And so that's what we call our Zone 2. This is an opportunity to really connect in with anchor institutions in our community. And Zone 3 has something we call the Goodyear Tract. And the Goodyear Tract is several hundred acres of industrial space, again, right in the heart of South Central Los Angeles. And it's got several hundred businesses that are there. And the goal here is to be able to figure out how do we connect in. All of these resources are sitting there, but there hasn't been enough organizing and focus on how to use those assets to support the residents and businesses within South LA. Next slide. Oh, okay, great. So we are now at the end of what I had considered to be, you know, the initial part of my presentation. The question that was asked of me was about, you know, intersectionality. And as you can see, for us, it is how can we look at place and where people are spatially located in the city who have less access to employment, transportation, and in some cases, health facilities, and figure out how, and given one of the things that I didn't make clear with all the statistics is that there is a key part of this area is that the majority population is Black and Latino. And these are the folks who I just described as not having access. And this is the same neighborhood that I grew up in. And so, you know, the goal here is to be able to identify external resources, to have a coordinated strategy, and to break down silos between organizations and coming up with a strategy and a plan for working together. A number of these, some of our outcomes are on our website as well. So I'd encourage you to take a look at that once we're, you know, done here. But look forward to the questions as we have going forward. I think we can end my presentation here. Thank you.
Thank you. That was very informative to learn about the work that's going on in the West Coast, and hopefully we'll be able to take some of those same principles and infuse them in our work here locally too. And a great segue to that is really to introduce PUSH and the work that Rahwa has been leading for years as a clear example of how we can bring art and culture and economic development that's truly empowering communities here on a local level. So I'm so excited to introduce Rahwa. Rahwa, do you want to talk a little bit about your work? You have approximately 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Franchelle. Good morning, everyone. I just also want to uplift Jolanda and Tunua. Like, I think your stories and how we do this work in intersectional ways, the only way that we're actually going to have success and impact in our own communities. So my name's Rahwa Ghirmatzion, another very strange name. These people did such a beautiful job of sharing a little bit about themselves and their stories. I'll tell you a little bit about my name. So Rahwa is actually Eritrean. So that's where I was born, is in Eritrea in East Africa. Displaced there due to colonialism. And, you know, we were colonized by the Italians and kind of like left to our own devices. So war broke out. And so my family had to escape that war. And we were resettled right here in Western New York. And Rahwa actually means unity. I always tell people that I think I was born with my fist like this because social justice and the inequities that people experience, the violence that people experience has always been a part of my cultural fabric. So a little bit about PUSH, of course, is that we were, you know, started in 2005. We were co-founded by two awesome young folks at the time, Aaron Bartley and Eric Walker. I'm sure most of you know them. And, you know, we are a local, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. So we're a local membership-based organization, and we work in community development. And, you know, initially we were thinking that we were very much interested in building affordable housing on Buffalo's West Side. And how that was all started is Eric and Aaron were organizers. So they organized and asked people in Buffalo at the time, what did they want and what did they need where they live? And there were two priority areas. One of them was livable housing, livable and affordable housing. Livable because many of these homes at that time were much more affordable, but Buffalo has the second oldest housing stock in the country and a huge disinvestment. And obviously you guys know that we went through an incredible economic decline beginning in 1970, where we lost half of our population and really just, you know, left the city in terrible, dire straits. And so that was a very big need. The other one was good paying jobs. At the time, most of the people, you know, were considered the working poor, but people worked, but most of the jobs that were available were minimum wage jobs and in the service industry. And so from that, they brought together about 400 residents that then created a plan and a vision for the West Side neighborhood. And so our mission at that time became that we are to mobilize residents that then they would create strong neighborhoods with quality affordable housing, expand local hiring opportunities, and to advance racial, economic, and environmental justice in Buffalo. And that theory of how do we do that really revolves around community control and community ownership of resources, because if you own it, then you can plan for it. And that will get us to a just transition strategy for transformative structural change. And I'll go a little bit more into that. I do want to lift up at this moment that LISC Buffalo was one of the first funders of this plan that we had created that I think many people probably thought was not going to be successful and very different when we look at what Buffalo looked like in 2005 and what it looks like now. So I just want to uplift, thank you, LISC, for believing and having faith in what the community wanted. So a little bit about PUSH is that we have a place-based initiative that we call the Green Development Zone. So that is about a 30-block neighborhood, and we decided we were going to do block-by-block approach to addressing all the different systemic issues that were in our community. So in 2008, we founded the Green Development Zone, and it combines green affordable housing construction, community-based renewable energy projects, housing weatherization, green jobs training, green infrastructure, and vacant land restoration, all towards the goal of creating pathways of employment for neighborhood residents, reducing our carbon footprint, also gaining control over public and private capital for triple bottom line projects. And we saw that as creating an economic growth, equity, and environmental sustainability to help us build the foundation for building new, local, living, loving economies. How do we do that? Well, we begin with the premise that people know what they want where they live. And it is our responsibility to uplift, to listen, and translate the inherent wealth of knowledge that everyday residents hold. How we connect to where we live is not technical for us. It is not data. We have good data. We work with a lot of awesome research partners like the Partnership for Public Good, for example. But we know that this is also personal. It's an emotional connection that we harness, and that this is actually universal. If anybody knows the Ubuntu saying, I am because we are. The Sikh faith says, I see no stranger. And that really talks about the interconnectedness of all human beings, all natural life. And we have to practice these in community. And so we memorize the steps that we take each day and the milestones and markers that act as a guidance, only we know, of how do we connect to place? How do we connect to a place we have known our whole lives, but now is changing due to forces beyond our control? And we know that the transition to a new economy is inevitable, and that we also know that justice is not. So we work with principles that we call just transition to inform and guide our work. Those principles of moving from an extractive economy, one is that is extractive of people, of the planet, to one that is regenerative of people in our natural world. And how do we do that? We do that by shifting economic control to communities, by democratizing wealth in the workplace, by driving racial justice and social equity, by retaining and restoring our cultures and our traditions. And we see that as a life way. And by relocalizing most production and consumption and advancing ecological restoration. And one of the things that I definitely wanted to do in the beginning and kind of forgot, so I'm gonna come back around to it and wrap up my presentation because I want to save enough room for a conversation. And that is, a reminder of why we have to work in an intersectional way, why we have to understand that everything is interconnected. For example, housing is connected to policing. As we address gentrification in our communities, we see an increase in policing so they're policing us. They are displacing us. As we think about the climate crisis and the ecological devastation, and now that there's a move to the city where they're gonna pour all of these resources, what's gonna happen to the people that were living there, And so what we're trying to do is build a multiracial, intergenerational movement and build community resilience together and create mixed income, mixed neighborhoods if we have to, but we have to focus on the most vulnerable and the people that have been historically and currently bearing the burden of extraction, including pollution, including economic inequality, and obviously racial inequality. And how we do that is we root in the truth of that right now, here I am in Western New York, and I stand on Haudenosaunee land, and we have to address, began with colonialism. And this is their land. And, Indigenous practice has all the things that we're trying to get back to and what a just transition really is. And that this country was built by stolen labor. And so those are the economic inequities that I think we have to, if we start from there in that truth, and we begin to try to unwind and do it in a way that is also about seeing no stranger and building together a just transition where we're not planning just for ourselves now, but the 7 generations ahead of us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rahwa. Next, I want to introduce Mona, who's from the National LISC Safety and Justice. That'll talk a little bit more about intersectionality.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Mona Mangat, and I am the Vice President of Safety and Justice at LISC's National Office. This has just been an incredible day. I'm so fortunate that I've been able to tune in and have been invited to this. I can't imagine what an in-person event in Buffalo or Western New York is if this is the virtual version. So thank you just so much for having me. Our team works in partnership with obviously our local colleagues across the country and then all of their partners to advance community and resident-led solutions to address crime, fear of crime, safety, and to advance justice. And for us, that's all at the neighborhood level. And as you know, that's been kind of the theme of today. Our work is really built on so much of what Lauren and so many others spoke about since this morning, which is this lateral co-creation of work. And that's the heart of what we support and what we invest in. And the results that we have that really speak to advancing safety and justice are so impactful, but they're really stories of what we've touched on today around placekeeping and really tapping into the expertise, the knowledge, and the culture of the local neighborhoods to really address and prevent crime. There's so many programs that I want to talk about, and I know we have really limited time, so I am also in the link just sent 3 links to articles that would love for you to look over, and due to limited time today, I'm happy to share more or make connections to any of these groups or others. What I wanted to talk about was just the intersectionality. So much of the focus of today has not been safety and justice, but everything that is working on, that you all are working on and talking about, really are tools for crime reduction, for crime prevention, for establishing really kind of solid and productive relationships between residents, community-based organizations, and partners at the city level, and even law enforcement, which right now we know is very, very complicated, and frankly always has been in so many of the neighborhoods that we've been working in. Our work is really rooted in the idea of over-policing. We know that that exists, we know that it's real, and all of the efforts that we support are really trying to address that. And one of the examples I wanted to talk about today was just cleanups, community gardens, public art installations, neighborhood cultural events, just being so inspired by the art of Idris and so many other stories, that these really creative ways to reactivate, often for us, are focused around reactivating abandoned spaces, deteriorated properties, and nuisance properties, can often be fairly low cost compared to the really massive development projects that are underway. And these kind of efforts that are on the side of a little bit more simple have really, really outsized impact. For us, what we're always trying to kind of show data and lift up stories about is when you think about crime in neighborhoods at the neighborhood level, community level, along corridors, it's most often happening at very discrete locations and amongst very discrete people. So crime isn't happening across neighborhoods by all. It's a really small group, and it's typically a small amount of kind of what we refer to as hotspots. And what we try to do is really bring together these local coalitions led by community, led by residents that are trying to select through their own way, looking at multiple data sources, not just crime data, but perceptions of crime, perceptions of fear, how properties are used, to identify where we should focus and what are the community-led solutions that can be the result of that. So one of the articles that I shared and one of the examples I wanted to talk about today was in Richmond, Virginia. We have just an amazing partnership that launched a basketballs and what they call a life skills program. It's founded by two formerly incarcerated men. They were incarcerated for a combined 40 plus years. And while incarcerated, they had just kind of committed to launching a basketball league where players from rival neighborhoods are coming together peacefully. And they're coming together peacefully because this is brokered by such a respected group, by just someone that truly can be a broker of really difficult conversations. And as someone had said earlier, they're the ones that have the PhD on what's happening in the neighborhood. These games are preceded by mandatory workshops that they hold. So they have a motto of no jump shots before workshops. And they're focused on critical thinking, problem solving, conflict resolution. Doesn't sound like exactly a safety rooted organization, but it is. The project impacts are they were able to end a 12-year feud between rival gangs that took many, many lives. The work of the league resulted in actually an 8% reduction in crime overall through the city. That's how problematic it was. And there were the work of what they did on conflict resolution was able to connect many residents to financial opportunity resources, job resources, resources that the city had been trying to kind of connect the local community with, but it just wasn't being heard, or those connections weren't being made. Also, just a really strong example as we're talking about defund police and what that means. The former police chief credits that 8% reduction in the city's overall crime rate to this specific group. As he said, there's nothing, he's never seen anything like this in his 30 plus years. And we have so many stories of that where you have police chiefs, prosecutors, district attorneys pointing to these community-based and community-led solutions as the answer, as this is what works. And it really comes from the intersectionality, right? This is a sports-focused program, a recreation-focused program that really leaned into this and was able to be the community solution that both residents welcomed and really at the city level felt the same. And just wanted to quickly share one more, and in the link on San Antonio, if you scroll down, you'll see there's great video and audio of all three of these stories that I'll mention. But in San Antonio, there's a collaboration called the Resurgence Collaborative, and they were really rooted in a really comprehensive redevelopment of the east side of San Antonio, which had the city's highest rate of adult probation revocations. And what they found as part of this much broader redevelopment process is so many of the revocations and so much of the reason why people were returning to incarceration was simply difficulty traveling to the probation office downtown. So Tunua talked about the kind of commute to work and what the data can show and how that can be so strategic. This is a very similar story focused on sort of what became a systems change for justice reform efforts locally. And the solution to that was revitalization focused. So the partners came together and they actually refurbished a community building, a vacant community building, to provide a neighborhood-based probation office for the county. And they co-located services for the adult probationers and their families in this neighborhood location. The impacts were extraordinary, 40% in the first year reduction in adult probation revocations. among the probationers in the East Side, and 500 individuals served on a monthly basis for multiple partners at that center that was launched. So one of the clear messages that I really want to leave you all with is kind of going back to Lauren's launching the Institute to provide communities with the tools and the language. So much of this work is that you're doing is on the front line of crime prevention, crime reduction, and really systems change for justice. And that is what we need to be lifting up. Those are the solutions that work. The Jolanda's example and how they can be so powerful in fines and fees. There's so many of those throughout the network, and we really want to connect you to those resources, not just by a quick introduction here in these articles, but really be able to connect you with other communities and residents doing the work, leading the work, and we would love to be a broker of those relationships, and really looking forward to sharing more and answering any questions you have in a few minutes.
All right, thank you so much, Mona. Right now, we are going to transition to a few questions. Again, if you have questions, I'll just ask that you utilize the chat box, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. The first question that I have, just reflecting on some of the incredible work and the projects that you all have talked about, that doesn't come without its own set of challenges. Can you specifically talk about some of the challenges that you faced, and then because of those challenges, what systems need to change as a result of that? And anyone can chime in.
I'm happy to give you a really good example, and I don't know if this is quite the question, but obviously there's lots of challenges in that the way that we know our communities need things to work, like the policies aren't there. You know, we live in a very extractive system that's not how it's designed to work. It's actually working very well, and that it's working the way it was designed, but it doesn't work for us. And so, you know, we had a campaign in the state where New York State has now the most advanced and equitable climate legislation in the country, possibly the world, called the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. And one of the key features of that mandate is that 40% of all clean energy funds will go to frontline communities or disadvantaged communities. And they'll be able to go into economic development and other kinds of investments that are holistic, that the community can choose for itself what's important to it. And so it's addressed, you know, we're going to use all kinds of different criteria and markers. But for us here at PUSH, it's really important to have what we call our place of practice, which is the green development zone. And we want to practice how these policies are working so that as we're tuning it, we're giving real examples of how is it working for our community. And so we set out, our next housing project is going to be on 14 parcels of land. It's going to garner, initially was supposed to be 53 units of affordable and supportive housing, housing people that have mental health issues, addiction, and facing homelessness, with a partner that actually does this and has wraparound services for people, because that's not what we do. And we're building these homes to net zero passive house standards, meaning no gas lines in Buffalo, New York, y'all. And because, you know, 40% of emissions actually come from our homes, including gas stoves, which we have high asthma and other kinds of health outcomes that are not beneficial. And we will, of course, also have a workforce aspect to it, in that we're training men and women in these new energy system technologies that they'll be able to get connected to and be paid family sustaining and prevailing wages. And we ran into a huge challenge with how we do our community work. You know, we're a neighborhood in transition. We started planning this 2.5 years ago, and we have some very strong new members of our community that have been living there for less than 2 years. And so they came out really heavily against this project. So we have to go back to the drawing board, even after 2.5 years of planning, and say, hey, okay, so clearly this neighborhood's changing, but you live in this neighborhood now. What do we need to do? And what they said to us, and they had very valid points, is that it was too much density. The West Side has an incredible amount of young people ages 0 to 18 that live there, and there aren't enough amenities for young people. So between the traffic patterns and everything else, we want more green space. And so we thought that that was very valid. So we went and worked with them. And while we, as a developer, you know, that's one aspect of what we do, is that we're a developer, but we're also community organizers. And so we got the variances we needed to build, you know, 11 units. And then we came back and decided that no, actually we would not. So we saved one of the parcels of land that we own, and that's going to be a pocket park or basketball courts or whatever the young kids want. So we're going to engage it with the kids to see what they want. And then across the street, we built a smaller unit, you know, only 4 units and not 6, and to the design that they wanted, which was more of a townhouse style instead of a small building. And so I think those are both the challenges, but also, like, I hope as an example of, you know, it could be a great project. Like, no one in Buffalo is going to say we don't need more affordable housing and more quality housing, right? But also there are other needs. And it's like, you have to connect with the people that are ultimately going to be there. And is that the most relevant thing for them? And being able to pivot and change, you know, like, and make considerations. And we went back, we had to redesign all kinds of things and what have you. It's still going to be an amazing project, and it'll be the project that the community wants.
So thanks so much for that. I was thinking about, there's lots of challenges, but let me just focus on 3 that were top of mind. First, when it comes to us getting to a point where you're ready to almost create a plan or to move forward with an economic equity, racial equity agenda, the community's like, I don't want to plan again, right? So the challenge is getting folks to a point where you can do some planning. But part of what we were focused on was that this was to create an action plan. This was to get to implementation. And so we moved very, very quickly from this concept of, we got the data, we kind of know, you know, when we got the data, we knew from a gut check what kinds of things would be in there, but now we have that information and let's get to work. So that's one challenge, is sort of the fatigue of planning and people are ready to get to work. You got to have a little bit of that plan, but you move quickly through that and you get to work fast. Second is, here's an example of this part of Los Angeles is an area that needs jobs, right? Unemployment rate is the highest in this area of any other part of our city. And yet analysis showed that the city of LA itself, as a generator of jobs, middle-class jobs, entry opportunities that create sort of careers and lifetimes of access to good quality jobs, the people who lived in this neighborhood were the least likely to have a job with the city of Los Angeles. So structurally, part of what we need to be focused on is, how do we get the systems, the city, this large anchor employer, to recognize that we've got to target these opportunities to the places and the people who need it most. So that's another opportunity. So that it's still it's a challenge in terms of getting there. Another area that we found is that this part of Los Angeles, it's got small businesses, it's got some larger businesses as well. But what we found is that the city of Los Angeles spends billions of dollars every year on all kinds of goods and services. And yet this part of Los Angeles was receiving less than 1%, like less than 1% of all of the contracts and the supply chain opportunities that the city is offering. So again, that's a huge challenge. That's a structural issue. And we've got to figure out, how do we make sure that if we've got an area within our city that is suffering from economic blight and neglect, when we have the resources, we got to make sure we're directing them into the neighborhoods, into the businesses that need it most. And so this has been part of our advocacy and our work, is ensuring that there is opportunity, and we're setting goals, and we're opening the doors, not necessarily lowering the barriers, but at least giving people a sense of what is going to take and helping them get there so that they can be part of gaining access to those jobs, gaining access to those local contracts from the city.
Thank you. Mona, did you have anything that you wanted to add on that?
Sure. I mean, the only other piece I'll add is just one key kind of critical conversation is always, this should never be about picking and choosing, right? Like, this isn't safety versus revitalization of safety versus economic development. It's all the same piece. And I think opening up a slot at, these cross-sector teams, these collaboratives, these engagement processes, the quality of life planning, to bring safety in the conversation that doesn't feel like it has to be a silo, but part of the bigger discussion is only going to complement it. And that sometimes takes convincing when it shouldn't, because as I said earlier, all of these strategies and looking at just adding in a layer of data around whether it's safety or crime or whatever kind of component it is really helpful. But sometimes that does become a challenging conversation when it doesn't need to be.
Thank you. And this question is specifically for Jolanda. Jolanda, if you, can you talk just a little bit about some of the barriers that you've encountered while trying to encourage biking amongst Black women?
Yes, I can. Hold on. Yeah, so basically, some of the barriers, I think, right, is like this trend of Black-led, you know, grassroots kind of established organizations not having the funding and the support like these white-led organizations. And so if I want to provide services to this population of people, I'm going to need the resources and the support to make that happen. And while there are organizations that exist, these organizations haven't necessarily come into existence to assist or support, you know, Black women or like Black gender non-binary people, which is very evident because like the bike sector is, you know, heavily white male. And so that's why groups like CGBT are so important. And that's why we need people to invest in us so we can continue providing those services, you know, authentically, not in this reactive way because everybody wants to talk about racial equity all of a sudden, but actually doing it because, hey, I'm a Black woman. I know what it feels like to be on the roads and not have access to things and stuff like that. So I think that's one of the biggest barriers is, you know, financial support, but just overall, like the entire, just support overall.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So we have just a few more minutes. We are doing excellent on time, but I want to leave off on a positive note. I know we talked about a lot of challenges that we face doing community-based work, but I want to hear from everyone. Jolanda, feel free to chime back in as well. What are the projects or neighborhoods that are really serving as a sense of inspiration for you during these very challenging times?
Can jump in on that one. The projects are, I can't point to a city, but one of the programs that I've seen has been such a source of inspiration is, I don't know how many are familiar with street outreach workers, in some places known as violence interrupters, but there are many different models for it. And they are responding to kind of most often gun violence in cities and are sometimes there prior to even the police often, which is a really good solution and one that's really recognized now by law enforcement is really working. Obviously, to do this work, street outreach, kind of on call, 24 hours, working crazy hours, middle of the night in really dangerous situations, you need to be really trusted. You need to really be the kind of community gatekeepers. What they have done during COVID-19 has just been remarkable to see them shift from that classic violence interrupter role to doing work around food security, personal protective gear, connecting people to kind of small grants, working on trying to get youth access to Wi-Fi for school or for just resources for connection because they see how critical it is. That's been a program that across the country you just see as one that's so, there's such a lack of true investment in and has the power to do so much even in a crisis the way they've pivoted. So it's one example that we've been really proud of and we're really looking to support more.
Thank you. So that we can end on time, I'll ask everyone to keep their final remarks to just 1 minute.
Sure. I would say that the bright spot for me in a COVID-19 crisis that has absolutely changed our sort of orientation on everything. It's required us to think about everything differently. I have called for and said that everybody needs housing, and it's clear more than ever that we've got to get that done. It is for the health and safety of everyone. We have called upon the need for equity and grants for Black-owned businesses, and with the various federal programs and local programs, all of a sudden that's happening. We've called upon the need for public health and health care for everybody. And we're starting to see the importance of that, and we're moving towards that. We've called upon looking to create, cleaner air and trying to drive less or figure out how we move to cleaner vehicles. And all of a sudden, in Los Angeles, there's no traffic during rush hour, and we're not putting all of that particulate matter into the air. And so this idea that we can't do anything different because the system is set up in a certain way, these last few months have shown us that if pushed to that point, which our communities are at that point, we need to and we can change. And it is for the health, safety, and betterment of everybody that we find a way to make sure that we have communities where people are housed, they have economic opportunity. We talked about universal basic income. Many of us are looking at that, and that seems impossible, yet everybody got, people got a stimulus check and we got extra from unemployment. So all of these things can be possible, but we've got to, really catch this moment and continue to push for those things that we know are necessary for our communities to be well.
Yeah, and I'll say really quickly, I gotta shout out the African American Health Equity Task Force, because they've done a lot to respond to those in crisis during the COVID-19 pandemic, and really kind of lifted up how there were already inequities in these same zip codes. And now with the COVID-19 crisis, these same zip codes and people in these communities are also being impacted in similar ways. And also I wanna shout out the organizers that are on the ground protesting to defund the police and kind of reimagining safety in our communities. Those folks are really, really important to the work. So, and they all aren't at just one organization, but these are people who are just passionate about, keeping our community safe and holding those in power accountable.
Yeah, I'm gonna jump in here. Thank you so much, Jolanda, for raising that. I'm gonna raise it again. I am more excited about the power that's in the streets of Buffalo, New York right now. And it is an intersectional multi-issue coming together of folks, and it's been nonstop. I also just want to lift up that we passed Carriel's law that is bringing me an incredible amount of joy, that something long-term impactful is going to happen in our communities. And now we all have to fight. Everybody's here. I've got an audience to let you know we got to get her pension back and compensation for what she has suffered over the last 14 years. I am always, always excited about the work that PUSH is doing, the Sustainable Workforce Training Center, this housing project, the mutual aid work that we did. But I also just want to lift up Anchor and so many other organizations that came together to cast the widest net for our community and work with each other in ways like we've never had, including, Erie County having childcare assistance now, having the rental and mortgage assistance, the water shutoff moratorium that is also passed at the state. So I just want to say that, I read this, I'm reading this remarkable book that's bringing me a lot of joy. And yes, these are dark times, but is it the darkness of the tomb or is it the darkness of the womb? And a doula always tells you in these moments to breathe and push. And I think that's the moment that we're in.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I have found so much hope and inspiration in the words that have been shared in this session in particular. We have some fierce, dynamic powerhouses in this session, but all throughout this morning. So thank you for everyone that has spoken, told their stories. I think it's a testament to the true renaissance that's happening in our city, that's coming from the bottom up. So thank you, LISC. So excited to be here, and I'm gonna transition to Brittany so she can talk about lunch.
I'm going to take up for Brittany. It's Julie again. I want to thank every one of our panelists, and I want to thank Franchelle for moderating today. It is really such an honor and a privilege to be able to have all of these sheroes, sharing their stories and generously giving us their time today, because we know you have so very much amazing work to be doing, and also, to hit you on a weekend, which is one of your few restorative times, is just totally a little bit unfair. So thank you all. Hello. Friends, and it's been a pleasure also for those of you who've had kids coming in and out of the conversation. It's a delight. Zoom is allowing us to see our families and our full community in a way that we haven't in many, many times.